Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter.
TV snooker commentator Ted Lowe once said, "For those of you watching in black and white, the pink is the ball next to the green." Sounds a bit bizarre, but it wasn't at the time, because up until the late 1960s, colour television was just a dream.
We take it for granted today, but it's important to remember that not that long ago, colour television here in the UK was seen as a groundbreaking and quite exciting step forward. It had certainly been a long time coming. The Americans had cracked colour back in the early 1950s, so surely we wouldn't be that far behind? Well, it would be nearly 15 years before Brits could experience colour on their TV sets, their experiences limited to trips to the cinema. By the mid-1960s, there were some programmes being shot in colour, like Jerry Anderson's Thunderbird series, but on its initial airing, it was transmitted in black and white. However, the days of monochrome looked to be finally on the way out when in 1967, the relatively new channel, BBC Two, began a full-time colour service, with the Wimbledon tennis tournament being a great early showcase for the new technology. A few years later, the two main channels, BBC One and ITV, would launch their colour services simultaneously on the same day, the 15th of November 1969. Granted, only a very small percentage of Brits had access to a colour TV in 1969, and in ITV's case, despite claiming to have kicked over to colour, this wasn't as immediate and as all-encompassing as you might think. ITV isn't simply just one TV channel. Since its inception, in 1955, it was a network, formed of several different companies, each of which would have the franchise and right to broadcast programmes on behalf of ITV to their respective region. When the colour revolution arrived, 15 different franchises were in operation on the ITV network, and despite the years of preparation, when it came to ditching black and white, only 4 of them would launch their new services on the 15th of November, alongside the BBC. So let's journey through the timeline of the ITV network's transition to colour television, a journey that took longer than you may have thought. The first 4 franchises to launch colour were as follows: ATV, broadcasting in the Midlands, Granada, broadcasting in the Northwest.
Well, this is Granada, and now Richard Harris and Sean Connery star in The Molly Maguires.
Yorkshire, broadcasting in, well, Yorkshire. And LWT, broadcasting in London on the weekends. All 4 would launch colour the same day as BBC One, on the 15th of November 1969, and, in some aspects, it makes sense as to why these were amongst the first. Granada was behind ITV's biggest soap opera, Coronation Street, so getting that in colour as soon as possible must have been a top priority. Yorkshire and LWT were in their infancy, having only taken over their franchises the previous year in 1968. But considering they covered 2 key areas of the country, having some sort of colour service in operation would have been seen as a must. ATV was one of the elder statesmen of ITV at that point, and again, as it covered the Midlands, it had the resources and the means to embrace colour as soon as it could. It's a factor that's often overlooked, the sheer cost of transitioning to a colour service. It's a lot more complicated and expensive than just switching out cameras. Huge swaths of the technical departments behind each of these companies would have to be overhauled, with tons of new equipment having to be installed and set up in order to run a colour service and do so with stability and consistency. Not to mention upgrades to transmitters, or in some cases, brand new ones having to be built from scratch. It is for these reasons that it would take some of the smaller ITV companies a long time to kick over to colour, as we'll see later on in this timeline. The 5th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Thames Television, 2 days later than the first batch, on the 17th of November 1969. Thames was another new kid on the block, being the result of a rushed combination between previous franchise holders, ABC, and Rediffusion. There's a very clear reason as to why Thames was 2 days behind some of its peers when it came to launching colour TV. With LWT operating in London on the weekends, Thames would operate during the weekdays, between Monday and Friday. The big arrival of colour, the 15th of November, was a Saturday, hence why LWT was amongst the first. With Thames next on during Monday the 17th of November, it was the first chance they would get to showcase colour, and so they did. It's also no surprise that both franchises operating in the London region were amongst the first to launch colour for ITV. London is the capital of the UK, and also has the most money pumped into it, and I can imagine the ITV bigwigs of the day couldn't possibly have allowed London Knock to be amongst the first to operate colour telly. Some things never change, eh? The 6th and 7th ITV franchises to embrace colour were Southern Television and Scottish Television respectively, both doing so on the 13th of December 1969. Southern comes as no great surprise, having been around for some time by 1969 and operating in the south and southeast of England. It had the resources and financial means to upgrade and launch colour sooner rather than later. For STV, it's nice to see a franchise holder outside of England make the transition early on. Operating since 1957, this was the principal broadcaster representing independent television up in central Scotland. I can imagine the feeling in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland was that the sooner they could launch their colour services on behalf of ITV, the better for them, and indeed their audiences. Speaking of the regions, the 8th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Harlech Television, doing so on the 4th of April 1970. Representing Wales primarily, but also the west of England, HTV was amongst the new names that came in during the 1968 franchise overhaul. It had replaced TWW, which had disappeared in not the best circumstances, shall we say, but taking over just as colour TV was high on the agenda must have been a daunting task indeed. Against any odds, they were able to wave goodbye to black and white less than 6 months after the initial date. Not a bad accomplishment whatsoever. Viewers in Wales must have been happy for the relatively early arrival of colour, though as the case in any part of the UK, many wouldn't have direct access, as the cost of colour sets was still wildly out of reach for the majority back in 1970. Consumer costs aside, Wales, as well as central Scotland and swaths of England, now had ITV colour services accessible to them. But keep in mind, we've barely covered over half of the franchises that existed. Who would be next to make the jump? The 9th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Tyne Tees, making the jump on the 17th of July 1970. Another elder statesman of the ITV network, Tyne Tees covered the northeast of England, another key area. Like with many other franchise operators though, the cost of upgrading to colour potentially prevented a service launch in 1969. 1970 also saw a recession play out, and that, combined with a levy on ITV's revenue imposed by the Pilkington Report, would see substantial revenue reductions. Nevertheless, launching a full-time colour service within the first year of the competition, and some of its peers doing so, must have been a way off for the higher-ups at Tyne Tees, and it would leave just 6 ITV regions that needed to embrace the same transition. The 10th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Ulster Television, beginning on the 14th of September 1970. The sole ITV representative for Northern Ireland had launched at the tail end of the 50s, and was one example in where not only were upgrades having to be made in the studio, but also with transmitters. When the UHF transmitter in Divis was finally ready, its opening coincided with UTV's colour service launching, finally granting Northern Irish ITV viewers the chance to see their favourites in colour. By this point, still less than a year since the initial colour switchover, all 4 regions of the UK now had some kind of ITV colour service operating within them. This was far from perfect though. Whilst Northern Ireland and Wales were completely covered by UTV and HTV respectively, there were still sections of Scotland and England that were yet to see the other side in anything other than monochrome. As the 70s began to get underway, 5 franchises remained, who needed to make that all-important jump. The 11th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Anglia Television, kicking off on the 1st of October 1970. Launching in 1959, Anglia would serve viewers in the east of England, and also cranked out one of the most memorable ITV network idents of all time, with the classic Knight on Horseback model blaring on screens every day for decades. Around the end of the 60s, Anglia had been mooted to join forces with both Yorkshire and Tyne Tees in a new operation called Trident Television, an attempt to try and save said companies from financial collapse. The ITA, as it was then, granted the collaboration between Yorkshire and Tyne Tees, but ruled out Anglia's involvement. Regardless, Anglia would trundle on unabated, and with its colour service launching within the first year, it would help increase England's colour coverage of ITV programmes even further. Who would be next? The 12th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Westward Television, starting on the 22nd of May, 1971. Representing the west of England, Westward TV was just celebrating its 10th year on the air by the time colour television would arrive. The broadcaster had some difficulty in transmitting clear signals to sections of its viewer base, but by the time it launched colour, matters had improved. The addition of 2 transmitters alongside the one based in Redruth only helped bolster the new colour service that Westward was offering. And what better way to celebrate or mark the occasion, like most ITV franchises did, by reshooting their symbolic ident in glorious colour. The 13th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Border Television, commencing on the 1st of September 1971. Being one of the last ITV companies to launch back in 1961, Border would serve the England-Scottish border, as well as nearby Cumbria, other surrounding areas and even the Isle of Man. It was one of the smallest companies in the network and would initially not produce much programming for it. By the time viewers could see Border programmes in colour, it had been nearly 2 years since some of its peers had first done so, though the launch date was significant, as Border's colour TV service would launch on its 10th birthday. What a way to celebrate! So whilst relatively behind, once upgrades were completed, Border wouldn't be the last ITV franchise to make the transition. The 14th ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Grampian Television, launching on the 30th of September 1971. Starting up in 1961, Grampian was another small cog in the ITV network, serving those viewers in the northeast of Scotland. The cost of upgrading to colour was a significant investment for the company, sinking in the equivalent of £3 million in today's money in order to do so. They also followed the same model as Border Television, as Grampian would launch their colour service on their 10th anniversary of being on the air. It's often overlooked how these smaller ITV companies provided such a vital service for viewers in those regions, particularly as some of them were unable to receive stable signals from the BBC, which meant that without companies like Grampian, some people would be left without a television service, period. But nearly 2 years after the introduction of colour on the ITV network, there was just one franchise left who had to make the change, and it would take quite some time before they were able to do so. The 15th and final ITV franchise to launch a colour service would be Channel Television, doing away with black and white for good on the 26th of July 1976. Yes, 1976. It may seem hard to believe, but Channel Television was nearly 7 years behind the colour revolution, almost 10 if you go by when BBC Two first brought the new advancement to the UK. But why is that? Channel was another small player in the ITV network, serving the Channel Islands, such as Guernsey and Jersey. Its audience reach was also a lot smaller, so with less revenue coming in from advertising, Channel Television could be quite vulnerable in the face of any major disruptions to the network.
We are limiting the use of electricity by almost all factories, shops and offices to 3 days a week.
The 3-day week of 1973 and 1974 hit Channel hard, but yet it trundled on. The usual costs of upgrading equipment were a lot for CTV to bear, considering the tiny size of their studios to begin with. There was also an added technical aspect to this transition, one that many in the early 70s outright deemed impossible. However, by the summer of 1976, the impossible had been made possible.
The IBA have a new special kind of aerial called Sabre, which will be installed in Alderney and which turns what they call a deaf ear to any interference. So we now get our colour pictures from Stockland Hill in Devon, via Alderney, to Jersey, and then on to Guernsey.
The story of Channel's long journey to colour is fascinating in itself, and perhaps we'll look into it more in depth some other time. But at long last, the entire ITV network was now finally broadcasting full-time colour services, and by this point, most of their audiences were watching in colour too. For 1976 would be the first year in which colour television sales would outmatch black and white ones. The costs had come down, more and more viewers were finally watching their favourites in colour, and in some cases years after those programmes had stopped being made in black and white. And thus, ITV's journey to colour television is complete. Beginning in 1969 and ending in 1976, it's a fascinating look at how a multi-component network, comprised of 15 parts in this case, all would move at different times, rather than all together. Had that been the aim, ITV likely wouldn't have broadcast anything in colour at least until a few years into the 70s. But this staggered transition that we ultimately got would serve some viewers better than others. Or would it? As mentioned, it wouldn't be until 1976 when more viewers were watching in colour than in black and white, the same year that all of the ITV network was finally broadcasting in colour. If you were one of the richest in London at the tail end of the 60s, then you could probably have afforded a colour set to see those first few days out of monochrome. But for millions, however, watching in black and white would be the reality for the first half of the 70s, and many were happy to make do. For ITV, the transition to colour across all of its network may have taken longer than it had initially hoped or planned for, but each company involved played a key part in this journey. And though many of them aren't around anymore, their place in TV history, particularly with their jump to colour broadcasting, is cemented for the years to come.
Well, this is Granada, and now Richard Harris and Shaun Connery star in The Molly Maguires.
Half an hour, the concluding part of The Two Mrs. Grenvilles. But now on board our Friday night viewing continues with comedy in The Two of Us.
Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Bruce Danton, Derek Chambers, Shaun Knock, Daud Khan, Liam De-Maine, Trev Hughes, AJ Mac 200017, Deck, Evan Hart 41, Jen, Traffy, Tim Ripley, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Ted Elliott, Marnanel Thurman, John Wakefield, Kieran Bolton, 40-something Manchild, Jerry Ralph, and John McLeod, our AMTV staff members.